You know that moment when a game transcends beyond its own exaggerations? Like when Metal Gear Solid Revengeance starts with Raiden tossing a Metal Gear ray into the sky that he then slices into dozens of pieces. Or when Dead Space 3 ends with killing a literal necromorph moon. Video games can either own or be hurt by instances like these that shatter suspension of disbelief. But for Kratos, that's just an everyday thing. God of War specializes in its anti-hero defying odds for the sake of unrestrained, grotesque power fantasies. Pandora's Temple and Ares couldn't crush Kratos. Perseus and Theseus, other sons of gods, were mere footnotes in his quest to defy the Sisters of Fate. Now with a legion of titans at his side to help kill Zeus after God of War 2's cliffhanger ending, how could Santa Monica Studio live up to a ridiculous setup like that? If there's one thing that I've learned about Santa Monica, it's that they've really earned their place among Sony's first-party crowd. Much like Guerrilla Games and Naughty Dog, they've pushed the absolute limits of the PlayStation consoles. And in terms of the whole medium, I wouldn't say they always do groundbreaking work narratively and design-wise, but to say they always do a good job would be an understatement. But technically, graphically, developers like these are at the forefront of the industry. And with God of War 3, I think that shows Santa Monica at its near best in almost every way, with a game that pretty much defines epic. There were bold plans for God of War 3. According to the director for the first God of War, David Jaffe, Zeus would have been killed at the beginning, and because of the vacuum the Greek pantheon left in the world, gods from other religions would have swept into Greece to fight for control over its people. Kratos would then battle Egyptian and Norse gods to the point of wiping out all of the main religion's deities, resulting in the quiet birth of a god-man born of a virgin because
man always needs something to believe in, something to aspire to, and sort of it was the beginning of the rise of the new gods that we have today, and a lot of people would say are also on their way out.
It explains why there's a mural in God of War 2 of 3 men on camels traveling toward a star. Regardless, I can see why the story's grand scope was understandably scrapped to leave the future open for potential spins on the franchise. Anyway, you remember Cory Barlog? The frank, sincere, kind of goofy director for God of War 2.
The object of the game is to stomp out other people's balloons, much like other people's creative dreams, without having your own balloon or creative dreams stomped out. It's actually a great metaphor for game development. It's a group of people shooting at each other's ideas down.
Are you supposed to stomp your own thing or not?
He helped write the script and plan out levels for the third game for several months, but felt it was time to move on after discussions he had with creatives outside of Santa Monica. He departed and studied under movie director George Miller for a while, helped with the development of Avalanche Studios' Mad Max, and joined Crystal Dynamics to direct the cinematics for the Tomb Raider reboot. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll come back to Barlog after a couple videos. That's not the last we've seen of him. Barlog's promotion to director may have been more of a surprise, but Stig Asmussen rising as a successor is more immediately understandable. He originally attended an architectural school and quickly discovered that his desire for form over function wouldn't jive in the field. He became a bartender for a while and immersed himself in video games during the day. His passion peaked for the medium after playing Resident Evil, which he considered a groundbreaking synthesis of film and gaming at the time. He eventually came across an ad describing the Art Institute of Pittsburgh in the defunct video game magazine Next Generation, so he saw that as his chance to get into game development. He went on to attend and graduate with a degree in computer animation media, worked with Atari for a few years on Gauntlet Dark Legacy and Dr. Mudo, and landed a job as an environment designer at Santa Monica for the first God of War. His strong presence and organizational skills earned him a title of art director over God of War 2. He continued to remain with the studio because of the freedom Sony gave the team and how much his peers pushed his creativity. So he was asked if he wanted to be God of War 3's director. He accepted. And as a side note, he's currently a director at Respawn Entertainment for its Star Wars title Jedi Fallen Order. I'm sort of looking forward to seeing more of that. With God of War 2 remaining put on the PlayStation 2, the team was eager to conclude the trilogy on the PlayStation 3. They started out by porting the second game's engine to the next-gen console. Once they ironed out the input of foundational mechanics and movement, they filled in and replaced parts of the old engine piece by piece. One trick that streamlined development is how programmers would give tools to designers to tweak things on their own time, rather than taking up the programmer's time. They'd need it, given how ambitious the game's concepts were to realize. Very little materials were reused. The game took inspiration from Shadow of the Colossus by making the Titans moving levels for Kratos to fight and climb on, which took a massive amount of time and resources to figure out. All the cutscenes were rendered in-game too. It's no wonder why the team went from 90 to over 100 members in doubling the graphics team after the game's showing at E3 2009. Even though the budget was a sweat-inducing $44 million, it paid off when God of War 3 became, and up until recently, remained the best-selling title in the franchise by selling 5.2 million units worldwide, around 500,000 more than what the first God of War moved. The game also outsold its competitors during the month of its release with over 1 million copies, also breaking records in terms of speed for the franchise. So, I can see why Sony would want to remaster. It's been ported by wholesale algorithms to the PlayStation 4, I think that was back in 2015, and whereas the original ran at 720p and fluctuated between 30 and 60 frames per second, this one has been bumped up to a nice 1080p and a smooth 60 frames per second. Bless up wholesale algorithms. It's the version I'll be playing for this review. It's a real bummer when a series of movies, games, or what have you has that one stinker fouling up the bunch, or it just doesn't live up to the lofty pedigree of its prequels or sequels. The first God of War may have had its flaws, but it overcame those with its strengths in Kratos' tragic backstory, the combat, and an ambitious world. God of War 2 improved and expanded on everything to a degree that's hard to top. God of War 3? I can say it hardly disappoints. Allow me to explain. Uncharted 2 Among Thieves was the first game that blew my mind with in-game cinematics. I was so used to titles like Kingdom Hearts that oscillate between in-game cutscenes with characters that have wooden faces, small sets of generic animations, and flapping mouths, and then pre-rendered cutscenes with all those problems wiped away. Naughty Dog caught me off guard several times when it would seamlessly transition between gameplay and cinematics. And if I'd been old enough to play God of War 3 around its release, 15-year-old me would have been swept away by its graphical prowess too. Comparing the jump from the first game to the second game is, like small refinements and optimization with scale, animation, and detail. But comparing the jump from the second to third game is like comparing apples and oranges. There's a snappiness and lively expression in the made-from-scratch animation that shines through, even if there are some slip-ups with voice synchronization. Character models are immensely detailed with a vast range of expressions and intricate detail. As an example, Kratos' character model has a memory footprint that fits on 2 PlayStation 2 consoles. The insane lighting and shadows are far more dynamic than previous games, flickering and casting with differing intensities and colors across environments, objects, and characters. Of course, it wouldn't be God of War without an overwhelming sense of scale, too. This game takes it even further by drawing inspiration from Shadow of the Colossus. 2 major sections of the game involve Titans as morphing battlefields, so you'll be alternating between fighting other enemies and climbing on Gaia and Kronos as they respectively react to you defending and attacking them. They're easily the size of the last Colossus that Wander defeats in Shadow of the Colossus. And even though they don't behave on their own like the Colossi, the Titans' predetermined paths that make way for platforming and combat will leave your mouth agape nonetheless. One aspect I praised about God of War 2 is how the scale and scenery are ever-changing and purposefully intended to make you feel like you're going on a far-reaching adventure. From the pits of Tartarus to the top of Mount Olympus, I think what's more impressive about God of War 3 is how fast Kratos can close distances in this entry by traveling from the top of Mount Olympus to Hades in a matter of minutes. There's also a pleasant sense of connective tissue between all the environments. Places you saw near the beginning will come into play later. You'll suddenly revisit or rediscover old places you didn't realize were right around the corner. Even though the game's linear, these fun moments remind me of Ratchet & Clank and Dark Souls' interconnected level design, which helps God of War 3 offset some of its uneven pacing since you'll unexpectedly linger in some places for a while and be in others for less than 20 minutes. It gives the impression that Santa Monica was reaching a bit to maintain environmental diversity because there's a load of dark, gloomy areas, though the settings do make sense in the context of the story's apocalyptic trajectory. Part of the struggle to keep things different is how the journey is vertically constrained to areas closely below, around, and on top of Mount Olympus, with some places revisited, whereas God of War 2 is an incredibly horizontal adventure from point A to point B, having the luxury of being more exotic with areas spread far and wide. Really, it just boils down to the game having a different brand and feel of adventure. I still prefer God of War 2 in the end artistically, but God of War 3 comes pretty close, and with its definitive edge, technically, it comes really close because, I swear, like, the game is just a marvel to behold so much of the time. The game excels with more environmental storytelling and a cohesive presentation of Kratos' impact on the Grecian world. You'll come across manuscripts in the underworld written by mythological figures and others connected with Kratos. Many will weave in snippets of how their terrible fates became even worse due to his past actions. That blame is even more pointed and present with the deeds you'll do in the here and now. The game begins where the previous one left off, with Kratos leading the Titans up Mount Olympus to wipe out the Olympians. And that's exactly what you do with Poseidon's death at the start. Then, Kratos manages to get to the top of Mount Olympus, but Zeus casts him down into Hades, where he loses much of his power by falling into the Styx River.
The gates of Hades have never held me!
Yep, that's right, ladies and gents. 3 times. He's escaped Hades 3 times. Well, technically 4. We haven't gotten the Chains of Olympus yet, which takes place before God of War. So, yeah. 4 times. At this point, I imagine Zeus is just like, "You've become somewhat of a nuisance, my son." Athena appears to him in a spirit form and offers her guidance to defeat Zeus. Kratos is rightly concerned about her motives, but he proceeds onward and slowly regains new powers by stripping other gods of their weapons and abilities. He gains Hades' chained claws, and the dead begin roaming the earth with no one to contain them. Kratos rips Helios' head off and strips Hermes of his boots, but the world is subsequently afflicted by never-ending nightfall and disease. The games have never shied away from Kratos' cruelty toward the innocent. This one, however, sticks it in your face. There's a tension between the gameplay and story that respectively forces players to commit even more gruesome, indulgent violence, and then guilt trips them for doing so. This is the first God of War to make me pause and sit back in horror when Kratos uses a hapless woman as a prop to hold a gate open with the crank collapsing on her, leaving nothing but a pool of blood and ambiguous appendages. You're led into thinking you can save her as you escort her out of Poseidon's chambers, but it's a ruse concealing Kratos' ulterior dehumanizing motives. Similar instances from past games are heightened here by murdering humans that get in your way during combat and platforming, who plead for your help and mercy as you slaughter them. All the while, you're constantly reminded of the havoc and suffering you cause as civilizations crumble and nature falls apart. Kratos is usually silent in the face of these accusations because he knows he's wrong, but he tells all to Athena.
And mankind suffers.
Let them suffer. The death of Zeus is all that matters.
Even though prior titles made me squirm sometimes with the depths of Kratos' depravity, this one forces you into some pretty disturbing circumstances that challenged my resolve, and they reminded me, dare I say, of the situations that Spec Ops: The Line would put you in with its brilliant meta-commentary on finding entertainment in violence. So, yeah, it's quite a comparison, and it's obviously at a much lesser level in God of War 3, but I couldn't help but be reminded of that. Asmussen even said, quote, "Anything that goes in that we look at and say, that's too brutal, or is worse than the definition of, this is what Kratos would do given the situation, it goes in and we keep it. Anything that we do and look at afterward and say, hey, this doesn't fit, it's too over the top, we pull back. And there are a few things we actually pulled back on," end quote. One such example is removing the 6-axis functionality of the DualShock 3 to snap Hera's neck. The final product has Kratos do this automatically, but I believe Santa Monica should have kept stuff like that in. Players should be held captive as the catalyst for Kratos' sins in intimate ways like this, because this is the cost of unbridled power and revenge. The Ghost of Sparta has closed his heart to everything, and players have to learn to do this as well if they want to play as him. In the end, the game shows how there ain't no rest for the wicked. Even when they succeed in their destitute, short-sighted pursuits, there's nothing to hold on to when you've destroyed everything.
But in the end, Kratos, in the end, you'll betray only yourself.
It sounds like the game contains deep themes critiquing itself, but I wouldn't call it groundbreakingly subversive. I'd say it's more theatrical than profound in execution. Speaking of theatrical, I'm reminded of God of War 2 and the over-the-top delivery and lofty writing for the dialogue. I consider its grandiosity intentional, but for some reason, God of War 3 actually goes a little overboard to the point of making me laugh out loud, especially with the bombastic adrenaline-pumping music. Hermes, Daedalus, Zeus, Hephaestus, they've got a bunch of quotable lines, but Kratos is the real star with the way he says winners like,
"There will always be another to stand against you."
They will fall as well.
You're the ghost of Sparta. Everyone knows who you are. Everyone is afraid of you.
There are reasons for that.
Look around at what you have done.
I see only what I have come to destroy.
If you thought he had great one-liners before, the game has too many where I couldn't keep a straight face. Writer Marion Cross, I can't pronounce it, I'm sorry. Marion mentioned how she didn't want the dialogue to be authoritative and lofty-sounding without reason and intention. And sure, some moments were surprisingly subdued. Most of the time, God of War 3's writing and delivery is hilarious, and I think that's a great thing. Quotes apply when I'm playing games.
You will not live to see the end of this day. I will have my revenge!
Do not deny me my revenge!
After all you have sought, after all you have sacrificed, it ends in another stunning failure!
And quotes apply in real life.
Zeus! Your son has returned! I bring the destruction of Olympus!
Touch on a child. I will tolerate your insolence no more.
So yeah, I didn't really expect that out of God of War 3, but there you go. All in all, if I had to summarize the pros and cons of the story, it seems like it tries to stretch itself a bit too far by setting back Kratos with some unexpected detours, while strangely moving forward quickly during key moments. This issue is subtly rather than egregiously noticeable, I might add, and doesn't really detract much from the game's bizarre and entertaining mix of funny and mature moments. Though I will say there were some things that caused me to scratch my head. One of the biggest things is Zeus. What in the world is he doing during the entire events of the game? Kratos is his #1 goal to eliminate, and he really only appears at the beginning and at the end of the game. What's he been doing? Anyway, if I could go back and change one thing about my God of War 2 review, it'd be how I said it has the best combat in the series by not overwhelming players with fluff, while adding enough new things that feel essential and important. I think that praise should go toward God of War 3 instead. The moveset for Kratos' iconic blades is nearly identical to the one in God of War 2, with the exception of a couple new ones. The combat grapple is one of my favorites, which brings Kratos closer to foes on the ground or in the air by hooking them and pulling himself forward with a shoulder charge. There's also a new type of grab that allows you to use an enemy's body as a battering ram before tossing it away or ramming it into a wall. Both of these additions are more efficient methods to close gaps on the battlefield, keep combos going, or get away from an enemy giving you trouble. I struggled in prior God of War titles to find good reasons to use ancillary moves. That problem's been mitigated here. One of my favorite changes to combat comes with the slew of weapons, abilities, and items at your disposal. What separated the second game from the first is that items played more fun, prominent roles in combat, puzzles, and platforming. The other weapons were also more distinct and advanced, albeit in small ways, with the unfortunate nuisance of needing to assign one of the extra 2 weapons in the menu instead of in-game. God of War 3 makes switching weapons a breeze, with one move that cycles through your inventory clockwise, but you can manually switch with a D-pad if needed. Abilities are now tied to your equipped weapons, so, for example, you need the Nemesis Whip out to cast an orb of electricity that chains through several enemies, much like Kronos' Rage in God of War 2. It can be somewhat annoying when you want to be using one weapon but another ability, but it's a minor inconvenience I'll accept, especially since items wonderfully come to the forefront this time. Items have a meter of their own that quickly recharges after a couple seconds. They deal minor damage and status effects to compensate for that advantage, so while the bow in God of War 2 could deal a ton of damage drawing from the magic meter, Kratos' new fiery bow is weaker and meant to do residual damage from a distance for a couple moments. It's also a pivotal, if not thought-provoking, item frequently used for puzzles by burning bramble blocking your path. This can be said for all the items which aren't essential during combat and lack compelling integration into puzzles and platforming. God of War 2 has the edge on the latter. Regardless, you'll want to use items frequently for special yet simple purposes, especially when you need to fall back on them if your magic meter runs out. I can appreciate how attentive the developer was to make items more prevalent. And hey, a good example of that is how you're encouraged to use some situational awareness with your environments, because you'll come across these big pots filled with bramble that can explode and injure enemies when you find them in a combat situation. Unfortunately, they're few and far between, but hey, it's some progress, and like I said, I can appreciate stuff like that. Santa Monica finally got weapons right for this entry that make compelling cases for their individual usefulness. You can get by just fine with Kratos' blades in the first and second games, but the third truly compels you to get more time in with the Spartan's growing arsenal. What amazed me is how they adapt all of the blades' moves with little foils and how they're executed. For example, the spinning attack you do with the former is drawn out and risky since it doesn't knock back enemies that much, but has great range and does loads of damage if used wisely. The mirrored move for the claws is fast and circles around Kratos like a shield, brutally knocking away encroaching foes within a short range. Whereas the grapple with the blades pulls Kratos toward an enemy with a shoulder charge, the claws rip these floating skeletons out of their bodies that fly around and do tiny amounts of damage, sort of like the Army of Hades ability in the first game. These examples demonstrate how additional weapons no longer have less than half of the moves the blades have always been privileged with. A later weapon like the Nemean Cestus feels even more different, since it's essentially a pair of metal boxing gloves that send out concussive blasts, which are a slower yet exceptionally powerful alternative to the blades. There are even these skeleton dudes that have these shields, which can only be taken out with the Nemean Cestus, another thing I've been clamoring for. Enemies with specific weaknesses that encourage weapon switching. And again, unfortunately, something like this has been underutilized in God of War 3. So you're not going to run into many situations where you have to use like the claws or blades on specific enemies because they can't be injured by anything else. It's an unfortunate opportunity wasted, but this isn't entirely squandered since I found that several enemy types were easier to take out with certain weapons. I fared better against the satyrs with the Nemesis Whip as an illustration. It's not their explicit weakness, but the unrelenting pace, aerial focus, and stunning electricity of the whip, despite requiring more hits to guarantee kills, prevents satyrs from moving an inch, which is a blessing since they're deadly and fast once they're on their hooves. With more enemy types and exponentially more to fight as well, God of War 3 is the pinnacle of the franchise in terms of combat that gives its host of weapons more purpose. Instead of sticking with the blades like usual, you'll feel encouraged to experiment with them all, because each one can grant slight edges in combat that you'll only discover with your playstyle and approach to this franchise's easy-to-learn controls that can be richly complex if you want them to be.
On the fly, you can change between the weapons almost more like stance shifts. So Kratos is able to, do a couple hits with his blades and then finish them off with the cestus, and it's incredibly seamless. And once again, we're just trying to evolve the combat, but at the same time keep it accessible, and at the same time keep it rich for the hardcore gamers.
The bosses left me unusually conflicted. Poseidon, Hades, Hercules, Kronos, and Zeus kept me on my toes and largely lived up to the pedigree of the franchise's baddies. But several others left me cold and wanting more. You'd think Helios and Hermes would be major bosses, but they're mere distractions that felt like needed concessions during development, rather than ones that were intentionally skipped over. Or maybe it is intentional to show how some of the Olympians are pushovers. I'm not sure. That'd be a hard one to convince me of. This is an issue that comes packaged with my issues with the pacing here and there, so while there's only half as many bosses compared to God of War 2's substantial lot, this is made up for to an extent with the visual flair and spectacle that are densely packed into the range of bosses in this game. Onward to the periphery interests people have in God of War. The platforming is mechanically identical to the second game, but there are small adjustments to speed up traversal. One new feature includes grabbing onto harpies to fly across gaps. It's mostly a novelty to gently help the platforming not feel repetitive in spreading out the combat and puzzles. There's also another wildly different feature with the Icarus wings, where Kratos flies upward within Mount Olympus to reach great heights while avoiding all these obstacles. It's a nice distraction with thrilling close calls as you barely avoid giant rocks falling your way and fit through tight corners. There are a few appreciated platform-heavy sections too, where you're stressed for time or need to time your movement well. Chasing Hermes around Mount Olympus and the Gates of Tisiphone are great examples. But my favorite platforming involves scaling Gaia and Kronos, because these sections are fused together with combat in an exciting, unpredictable balance that grabs your attention. Santa Monica learned to incorporate more puzzles with the second game, and that experience carries forward in the third with a great selection of light brain teasers. I've mentioned before how the developer doesn't recycle elements for puzzles, which thankfully shows in this game as well. One puzzle incorporates portals in a clever way, whereas a garden maze has this unexpected reality warping mechanic challenging your notions of perspective, which is definitely inspired by 3D drawings. While I wouldn't say the puzzles are necessarily better than God of War 2's assortment, they're definitely on par, and I'd wager the team devoted more time to setting them apart in concentrated areas that involve a series to tackle rather than puzzles spread out in bits and pieces, if that makes sense. In other words, instead of smaller puzzles being spread out more, they're placed together in larger chunks that take half an hour or so to solve altogether, because individually puzzles don't take long to solve at all. So I think it's better for the sake of pacing between the combat and platforming in the end. And speaking of the end, how do all the pros and cons of God of War 3 come together? It's not uncommon to see developers buckle under pressure in living up to their own masterpieces. After all, how can you begin imagining how to topple what people can't believe can be beat? God of War 3 faced that challenge with its intimidating predecessor, but it stands tall against it with a grand epic conclusion to Kratos' mission for revenge. Even if I couldn't take the writing and its delivery seriously at times, I loved it for what it was, especially with its unexpectedly mature moments where it forces players to reflect on the devastation and cruelty of Kratos. The platforming and puzzles match the high bar God of War 2 set with several minor improvements, but the combat represents the zenith of the franchise's potential in this area, with a superb control scheme and sets of weapons, abilities, and items that have equal exciting appeal and application. I may happen to like the setting, direction, and bosses of God of War 2 a little more than what the finale offers, but I'll be darned if I didn't admit that God of War 3 is close in my book as the king of the God of War pantheon, which closes out Kratos' task to kill the Olympians with a rousing shout that'll leave you in awe.